When Max Marshall arrived on the campus of the College of Charleston in 2018, he hoped to investigate a small-time fraternity Xanax trafficking ring. Instead, he found a homicide, several student deaths, and millions of dollars circulating around the Deep South. He also opened up an elite world hidden to outsiders. Behind the pop culture cliches of Greek life lies one of the major breeding grounds of American power. 80% of Fortune 500 executives, 85% of Supreme Court justices, and all but 4 presidents since 1825 have been fraternity members. With unprecedented immersion, the book, Among the Bros, a fraternity true crime story, takes readers inside that bubble. Under the live oaks and Spanish moss of Travel and Leisure's most beautiful campus in America, Max Marshall traces several CFC boys' journeys from fraternity pledges to interstate drug traffickers. The result is a true life story of hubris, status, money, drugs, and murder, one that lifts a curtain on an ecstatic and disturbing way of life. With expert pacing and a cool eye, he follows a never-ending party that continues after funerals and mass arrests. We are excited to welcome Max to the podcast today, as we caught up with him right before Thanksgiving in the midst of promotions for the book. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 75. An interview with Max Marshall, author of Among the Bros, a fraternity true crime story. Max Marshall is a writer and journalist. Raised in Texas, he attended Columbia University, where he graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa in 2016. He served as a Princeton and Asia Media Fellow in Hanoi, Vietnam, and his work has appeared in GQ, Texas Monthly, Sports Illustrated, and the New York Times. He lives in Austin. So thank you for joining us today, Max.
Of course, I'm happy to be here.
So let's just dive on in to the background of your book. How did you first get interested in writing about true crime in general?
So I did not expect to become an investigative journalist to write about crime. After college, I moved to Hanoi, Vietnam, and I was working as a journalism fellow at the Vietnam News in Hanoi. Well, I thought I was a journalism fellow. I was actually editing propaganda for the Politburo. It was a government newspaper. But while I was working there, we'd get all these it was very tourism focused. And I saw a small article in the Vietnam News about a Hollywood director named Jordan Vogt Roberts. He had just made Kong Skull Island, which is a big King Kong movie. He was 35 and had made a bunch of money. He's got all this attention. And in this article, it said he was selling his house in LA and moving to Vietnam to become the tourism ambassador. And I thought, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting story. Like, why would this guy in his prime, decide to move to Ho Chi Minh City? So I pitched GQ's website on like a short article about it. And I went to Saigon, spent a night with him. He took me to his favorite nightclub. And it was just going to be kind of a short write-up about this guy's new life in Saigon. And right before the piece ran, he called me from the hospital, and he had been out at a nightclub, the same nightclub he had taken me to, and he had been attacked by a dozen what seemed to be gangsters. They flipped his table, they started kicking him in the ribs. Then someone took a Hennessy bottle and smashed his head. He lost consciousness. He had contusions, hemorrhaging, massive concussion. They actually thought he was going to die for a while. And when he woke up in the hospital, he said, "Who did this to me?" And the police basically told him, "It's better you don't look into this. These are very connected people." And I was the only journalist he knew in the country. And so he called me and asked if I would help him solve the case. I had never done anything to do with crime. I'd never investigated anything in my life, but I was 22 and, had nothing else going on really. So I said yes. And for the next 6 months, we basically solved the case. But I mean, it took took a lot of investigating. But yeah, after that, I just kind of found myself lost in the rush of these investigations, and also, yeah, trying to kind of think about how to tell these stories and yeah, what goes into it all.
That's fascinating. And I think that article is linked on your website, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's still up there. Yeah, I think it's called Attack on Skull Island because his movie was called King Kong Skull Island, and they hit him in the skull. Um, but yeah, that was my first experience talking to police sources and sort of following drug supply chains and looking at camera footage and, developing anonymous sources. And so much of what it went into this book started then. And really it was actually right when I finished that story that I found this Charleston story.
Yeah. So how did that come up on your radar?
So yeah, I'd seen a lot of Xanax flying around when I was in college. I had friends who dealt. I had friends who got addicted. It's one of the one of two substances that are so addictive you can die of withdrawals. And I didn't know any of this going to college. I thought of it as, something parents took on a plane flight, but it actually was this incredibly popular party drug. And yeah, after doing that Vietnam story, I basically was thinking, okay, how could I write about Xanax on college campuses, kind of warn people younger than me, warn parents about this, but in a way that's not a sort of eat your vegetables, um, you know, trend piece, but maybe as something more of like a page turnery crime story. Because the other question I had, besides why are all these kids doing Xanax, is where's this Xanax coming from? It wasn't coming from Pfizer. It wasn't CVS brand Xanax. It was often chalky fake Xanax. And I'd been in a fraternity. I knew a lot of this stuff was coming through the fraternities. So I literally Googled, and I want to say this was actually sitting in a cafe in Saigon. I Googled Xanax bust fraternity. And the first result was this Charleston and Post and Courier article. Great article by Tony Bartlemey about this drug ring. And, it said they were using pledges to ship Xanax around the South. And, they'd gotten caught with an assault rifle and a grenade launcher. And I thought, this is pretty interesting. They said 44,000 Xanax pills had been confiscated. And then I started reporting and I found out that it was actually closer to, 3 million pills. And the story kind of fractaled out of control from there.
Going back to the thought of Xanax, what do you think it is about that particular drug that is so alluring to these college students?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because if you think of the sort of it drug for different generations, and obviously this is speaking, in broad strokes, but, you associate 60s baby boomers with weed and maybe acid, and you associate the 80s with cocaine. Those are very different drugs than an anti-anxiety tranquilizer that was designed for panic attacks and seizures. And I think part of it is there's just so much anxiety coursing through my generation. And yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that like one of our go-to party drugs is its main effect is making anxiety sort of disappear while you're on it. And of course you wake up and your anxiety rushes back even worse than it was the night before. So I think that's part of it. And then also it's a very effective drug for helping you black out. You can mix, a bar of Xanax with 4 or 5 Keystone Lights, and it's like you had, 12 Keystone Lights and you black out. And I think something that surprised a lot of people in my parents' generation is that's sometimes a goal. Like you want to get blackout. And so I think it kind of fits into that culture as well.
So once you started digging into this story,
Was it hard for you to find sources willing to go on the record?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at first, it was basically a total stonewall besides a few defense lawyers. Um, but a lot of it is you gain the trust of a source who then realizes, okay, this person has read all the police files, has talked to enough people that, he actually has some command of the story, maybe. And also he's not just looking to write some sort of like hit piece. And I think that was part of it. And I think part of it, honestly, was coming from a similar background as a lot of these guys. I think was really helpful. But yeah, it was incredibly difficult at first, and it took a lot of lucky breaks.
I can imagine. I could tell just by reading the story how it kind of unfolded over time that at first it
Yeah,
was a lot of anonymous sources, and then you started getting more and more people that were going on the record. Were you
yeah,
surprised
absolutely.
when you learned? Yeah. Were you surprised when you learned how this group in Charleston was manufacturing Xanax out of these beach houses? That floored me.
Yeah, I mean, I knew from the beginning that kids had their own pill presses, and it wasn't that hard. The advent of the dark web really changed the way drugs are sold on college campuses. And, I knew from experience that, yeah, people could buy Xanax powder online and then it would show up and they could pill press it out. But usually I was more familiar with like sort of a hand crank pill press or sort of smaller scale stuff. Maybe you're making a few hundred pills. But yeah, finding out guys that were making hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of pills um, at a more industrial scale, that was pretty wild. And then yeah, just the sort of intricacies and the details. I mean, it really was a fully functioning like industrial drug trafficking network.
So I think it's interesting that the main character in this story, KA member Mikey Schmidt, was only a college student for a year.
Yeah.
But he seemed to remain like this huge part of the fraternity, like in the following years after he left. Do you think it was because of his access to the drugs and everything else?
I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, you definitely see in some of these schools, and this goes against every national fraternity bylaw there is, but I've certainly seen it firsthand. You'll see kids, for instance, who go to the community college down the road, but functionally are fraternity members. And then you'll also see guys that might be taking a semester off or might have gotten kicked out who are still living in the college town, going to fraternity parties. And so it's not only guys who are, have the drug hookup that are invited back into the house, but I do think, yeah, of course, there's going to be so much status if you're coming in from Atlanta with cartel connected cocaine and all these famous rappers, and you're going from fraternity house to fraternity house around the South dealing cocaine and Xanax, and like you're kind of bringing the party, and all these people. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of status in that, and that's not even getting into the amount of money that sort of goes with it as well.
I felt like he was a character that was ripped right from a Hollywood script. You could not have made up a more interesting and connected and just mind-boggling character, I feel like. In the
Yeah,
course of
and I
your
mean, so much of
discussion,
it,
oh yeah, sorry. Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, just so much of it is also like, you know, he he has lived this absolutely wild life, and he's also, he's the only one from the drug ring that's still in prison. And so he's just had so much time to sort of sit and think about this stuff. And he's also just an incredibly charismatic storyteller, almost to the point where, you have to, he's such a good storyteller. He's so charming. There's a reason I had to interview 123 other sources as well, because like I think there's a version of this book where he just tells the story and you just write it down, and it's, this wild ride. But I was amazed how often he would tell stories, and then I would, look in the police files and there it was, like it, it is this sort of Hollywood life, and yet like it continued to prove itself as true over and over again.
So in the course of your discussions with him, through these contraband cell phones and all the other ways that you were able to keep in touch with him, do you feel like he has regret over his involvement in all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because I think so many of the primary feelings are what it was to be betrayed by his best friend, what it was to kind of have everyone flip on him and sort of get away with their crimes, and he's the only one serving time for it. And the book ends with maybe the recognition, not I wish this had never happened, but maybe I wish I had joined SAE and wouldn't have gotten in trouble. But I do think, yeah, there's definitely a sense of regret. And it's funny, one thing that was important to me in writing the book, or I mean, important's too big a word because this was a pretty small thing, all things considered. I felt like fraternities were written about incorrectly in a lot of different ways, and it's one of the things that got me writing this book. But a small thing that I always disliked was people always, when they write about fraternities and sororities, they talk about fraternity men and sorority women. But my experience on campuses is no one says men and women. They always say boys, girls, or kids. And there really is a sense of the people in the story being kids. Like, the older I get, the more I look at an 18-year-old and go like, wow, you were, still in many ways a child. And so I think that's also something Mikey has had so much time to just sit and think about is, he's now in his late 20s looking back on kind of what you did when you're 19. I think we all look back on some things we did when we were 19 and kind of hit our heads in the wall, but his is a much more extreme version of that.
That's true. Can you tell us about the young man, Patrick Moffley, who ended up murdered as part of his involvement in the Charleston area drug ring?
Absolutely. So yeah, Patrick is sort of the other main character in the book. He also is this kind of larger than life society party figure. His dad is a big time real estate developer, built a lot of homes on Kiowa Island for sort of the billionaire set out there. His mom ran for Congress in South Carolina, was on the Charleston School Board. They're a very well-known family. And he grew up on this sort of palatial horse farm, equestrian farm on what's literally called Paradise Island, off, kind of 30, 40 minutes from downtown Charleston. And yeah, the one of the chapters in the book is just an oral history of Patrick's life. He kind of was this, he was known for throwing these, massive 400-person parties out on the equestrian farm and jumping off balconies on King Street and breaking his ankle just so he could get a girl's number, and getting in fights in 3 different continents. He would ski the Alps and surf in Nicaragua, and he was just like, he was sort of this like party playboy figure. But on the first Friday of spring break 2016, at his house a block from campus, he was found murdered with a bullet hole in his chest. He was holding a Chipotle napkin to the wound, and lying on the floor, he was surrounded by hundreds of these fake Xanax pills. And it was basically those pills that he was found surrounded by that led to this whole drug ring being unraveled, because the DEA, the FBI, even the Postal Service, let alone Charleston law enforcement and state law enforcement, they all wanted to know, where did these pills come from? And turned out his house was a hub in this drug network, and that's how boys started wearing wires on each other and betraying each other, and ultimately so much of the ring sort of fell apart.
What really struck me in this story was kind of the attitudes of the boys involved, and also the attitudes of their parents that were kind of like, well, we're going to get this taken care of. We've got attorneys. You're not going to get in trouble. I can't get in trouble. There just didn't seem to be a lot of accountability. And it's almost like it trickled down from the dynasties of some of these families. Like,
Yeah.
none of the kids expected that they would get in trouble, and they didn't think they should get in trouble. it just felt like this whole mentality woven throughout the book in these kind of affluent Southern families that are well connected.
Definitely, definitely. And I think it's interesting, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing this name doing a podcast about South Carolina crime, but there is that this book came out the same week as the Murdaugh book, and some of these kids had the same lawyers as the Murdaughs did, and so there is this sort of a system of very connected, very powerful South Carolinian defense lawyers that really can get you out of a lot, a lot. And I talked to a lot of these lawyers. They're incredibly charming. They're great storytellers. There's a reason they're so good at their job. But when you have this system where you really can get away with so much, I do think, like, in some ways, this book is, it's kind of about the consequence of a life without consequences. Because if you can get away with, a DUI, maybe the next thing you try is selling some weed. And when you get away with selling some weed, maybe the next thing you try selling some Xanax. And when you get away with that, you might scale up again. And I did see that over and over again. You also see it in the fraternities themselves. The Kappa Alpha Order, after the whole drug ring got busted, they got kicked off campus in 2016, but they came back in 2012, and SAE never left campus. And so I think there's also, it's in the courts, but it's also in college. It's all over. It's like, you can get away with so much. Why would you learn something if you don't have to?
Exactly. So I was curious reading this book because I know that you were in a fraternity in college, and you mentioned that your parents were also part of Greek life. Was it difficult for you to separate yours and your family's experiences from what you were reporting on in this book?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, you don't need to separate them, because in some ways, it's like this bigger system that you're trying to understand and contextualize. And when you bring to bear your own experience, it can help, connect with interview subjects and all the rest. But yeah, I do think there is a bit of separation, because I wasn't setting out to write some like anti-Greek life screed. I think it's important to like hold both the seduction and destruction of this stuff, right? Like, there is an allure to it that I myself found. When I showed up to college, I didn't plan on joining a fraternity. And, within a month, it was like my whole social world. And so it would be dishonest of me to think I could be like this sort of outside finger wagger and be like, oh, these kids, how dare they join these systems, when I was part of it as well. So yeah, I think it's like, it also allowed me to try to be like, okay, well, what is the allure of this stuff? And like, why is it such a resilient system? And why even now are my, 5 closest friends from college the kids I pledged with? And yeah, so I think in some ways I saw it as like an insider's guide. It's like, okay, I am part of this world, and it's a world that's usually closed to outsiders. So how can I try to get it right and show what it's like on the inside? And it's sort of that like MFA cliche of when you're in a writing class or something, they say like, show don't tell, hold a mirror up to what you're seeing, and that's all you're doing. You're just holding a mirror up. And like, the mirror I had happened to be smeared with cocaine and all sorts of other things, but that's that's the mirror that I found.
And I really think it probably helped you make connections with a lot of these sources when they found out your background, because like you said, you weren't coming in as you weren't trying to do a hit piece. You weren't trying to come in and destroy and obliterate an institution. So I agree. I think that probably helped you. I'm curious, how long did it take you from finding the story, reporting, going to Charleston? How long did it take you to write this book?
I mean, I think first started thinking about it in 2018, started really doing the reporting in 2019. And then, I would say it was like a year and a half of reporting, year and a half of writing and editing, something like that. Plus, some extra time thrown in there for on the front end, sort of like getting my bearings in the story, and then on the back end, the sort of like final, edits and fact checking and all of the, that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's basically been my life since 2019. And it's quite a pretty crazy headspace to spend for 4 years in. But yeah, now it's sort of, you give up the baby for adoption, and people, take it in different places. Like, people have had such wildly different readings of the book, and like that's something I welcome, because I don't want to hold a reader's hand and tell them what to think.
What do you think a reader's main takeaway from Among the Bros will be?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said, it really varies. And I've seen a lot of different takeaways. I think some people, it's about that sort of consequence of no consequences, and the sort of like this party that never ends. Nothing, like, nothing can stop this party. Murders, arrests, deaths, shutdowns, and all the rest. Like, the party goes on, and so it's sort of about like the never ending party of our ruling class. I think in other ways it's about like we were talking about before, but the anxiety coursing through this world. I think it's interesting that these guys whose safety net in life is basically so plush it's a hammock, and you could just lie around in that hammock if you wanted to. Instead, you're blacking out on anti-anxiety medication. And I think for some people it's, a page-turny, twisty crime story with crazy characters and like all sorts of movie-esque, sort of twists and turns. And, I think it could be all of that and more or less, or, I think it's been fascinating to see the way all different people read it. I'm open really to any and all readings. It's not my book anymore. It's the readers.
So what are you working on now? Because I'm sure you're working on something.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of book publicity circus is winding down, and I think I want to eat a bunch of Thanksgiving food and go into a coma for the weekend. But yeah, I'm working on. Well, first of all, a lot of like documentary companies have reached out about doing this documentary forum, so I'm taking a lot of meetings about that. And then I'm slowly working on a book proposal for book 2 about a Texas oil tycoon. And that's all I'll say, but we'll see how it goes.
That's great. Well, I'm sure this book has opened even more doors for you with all the reporting and research you had to do and the writing. So that's really exciting to hear about all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really wild and intense experience, and I really am incredibly grateful to the whatever it was 125 people who told me their stories, and then the other people passed me on all the court and police documents as well. But like, ultimately, a book like this is just consisting almost completely of other people's stories. So it took a lot of bravery for some people to tell me some of these stories, and I'm very grateful.
I can imagine. And I would also, when I was reading it, I kept thinking, how did some of these people agree to talk to him? Like when talking about Mikey's connections in Atlanta and some of those characters at the nightclubs, they just seemed to speak so openly. And so it was very fascinating.
I mean, yeah, I think something I found is like, in the first time I found this was with hazing, in my own hazing, is that like, if you're outside the bubble, no one will tell you a single word. But once you're inside the bubble, people love to tell these stories because they think they're funny, or they think they're crazy, or they think there's like some status in them. And so like the closer the sort of deeper you got into the bubble, the more people would be willing to kind of tell their stories, often on background. But yeah, there is like, I could tell so many times when people were telling me like their hazing story or their craziest drug trafficking story or whatever it was. I was like, oh, you've told this story at a bar 50 times before. Like, it was so like not rehearsed, but in a way like they had it down. And that's also why like the police files and things are so important, because you have to balance the sort of like, okay, well, you're a very good storyteller. But yeah, there is this, once you're inside that world, there's actually a lot of pride in these stories, I think.
I can see that. So I guess it shouldn't be that I shouldn't be that surprised that these stories came out to you. But when I was reading them, I kept thinking, wow, he really managed to network his way into talking to some of these really, really intriguing characters in the whole Atlanta scene, which I thought was cool. It was cool to read all the places that these guys were traveling to pick up the drugs and distribute them. And then they headed off to this university, and then it was back to Atlanta, and then it was
Definitely.
back to Charleston.
Yeah, definitely. The sort of like, you had like your Georgia schools, your Mississippi schools, your North and South Carolina schools, some Florida, Tennessee. It really was like the whole South. And I do think another thing that was really helpful was like, I lived in New York after college, but like I'm not from New York, I'm from the South. And I think like just that knowledge that I'm not like the sort of classic like Brooklyn journalist here to find toxicity, or whatever. And like there's obviously a lot of amazing journalists in Brooklyn, but I do think like there is sort of an insider outsider thing that's always going on, and like being like, look, like we have LinkedIn connections in common, like I'm from Dallas. Like I do think that that made a difference.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I won't keep you any longer. I really appreciate you taking the time, because I know it's been a crazy past couple of weeks with doing press for the book. But I just want to thank you again for coming on the podcast. And I will share the link to the book in our show notes so that all of our readers can check it out, because I know they're going to be fascinated after hearing this conversation. Yeah. They're going to want to know more about all this. But, having a student in a SEC school, I found it extremely interesting. So I had some questions for her after I read this.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I imagine this is going to lead to some Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner table conversations for a lot of families. So
I think it probably will. And yeah. Honestly, right now I'm working on this week's episode is about deaths related to college fraternity and sorority hazing.
Oh, wow.
And that was really interesting to research. I didn't know. It's focused on ones that were in North and South Carolina. And it was... Are
you focusing on Tucker Hips or...
Tucker Hips is part of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically one student a year on average. So it's, in some ways, it's much less deadly on the aggregate than like fentanyl overdoses in fraternities or something. But it is this just thing that continues to recur. And yeah, it's fascinating. I'm excited to listen to the episode.
It does. And the thing is, like, I'm sure it's really hard to connect the dots and prove in a lot of cases that it was related to hazing. For one thing, because of the wall of silence, and for another, because of the way that it happens. It's not a from point A to point B kind of instance. There was also a young man that died at the University of South Carolina in 1980, and he got intoxicated during like the final night of Hell Week and basically choked on his own vomit. And it was very hard for his parents to prove that was connected actually to the university and to the fraternity because of the way it happened. So,
and that's a story that has happened just over and over again. It's so often like the Hell Week, like honestly, either, I mean, there's so many stories like that, or somebody will get in a car after a pledge event and then get an accident, or
like, there's also a story about that in this episode too.
Yeah. So I mean, that's such a
story.
Okay. Yeah. But that's such a common pattern. And then it's like, how do you show, because people imagine it's like, oh, they got paddled so hard or something but like really often what it is it's like they're forced to drink to a point where it either killed them or put them into a deadly situation. And yeah, I think like it's funny because the hazing experience, and I talk about this book, like so much of the hazing experience that students hate is actually the sort of forced servitude of like cleaning cars, picking up food, ghostwriting homework, like being the designated driver 3 or 4 nights a week. And it's like this full-time job that keeps you out of class. But then it's really often just like 1 or 2 nights of forced binge drinking that are the most deadly. So yeah, it's fascinating.
And everyone's doing it, so
yeah,
everyone's not dying from it. So then it becomes really hard to connect it to an actual fraternity or school. So that's
exactly
so hard. And to cap it all off, a lot of times legislators are part of the Greek system, and they don't want
absolutely
anti-hazing bills passed because they think they're overstepping the boundaries. So
definitely
it's really been interesting to research.
It's all connected for sure.
It is. But again, thanks for coming on the podcast today, and really enjoyed the book. It's a fascinating look. Our readers are going to check it out in the show notes, and I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving and eat all the turkey and fixings.
I'm mostly excited for the fixing, which we're about to do some deviled eggs tomorrow, my wife and I. So
that's the Southern. That's such a Southern thing, I swear. The deviled eggs at the holidays.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but it's the best. All right. Well, thank you so much. A happy Thanksgiving to you as well, and really enjoyed this.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Before we wrap up today, I'd like to tell you about a webinar I'm hosting next spring. True crime is more popular than ever thanks to documentaries, podcasts, and media outlets that produce gripping crime stories. This is great news for writers wanting to explore this market. Crime narratives are not only compelling for consumers, they can also help find justice for victims, their families, and the community. In fiction, using true crime elements and journalistic techniques can help deepen the storyline and add authenticity to characters and plot. Do you enjoy reading and consuming true crime content and would love to find a way to write and publish your own? In a webinar I'll be teaching through WOW Women on Writing next spring, I'll share how to find story ideas, how you can use true crime elements in nonfiction and fiction, where to pitch your own true crime work, and more. You also have the opportunity to send an article outline or project pitch to me for feedback. The webinar will take place on March 14th, 2024 from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and will be recorded for those who can't attend in person. The cost is $45 and there are a limited number of spots, so register today at wowwomenonwriting.com and click on the Classes tab. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd also like to support the show in a small way, you can buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com, Renee Robertson. Thank you so much for those who have already supported me through this platform. We're also now on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. Sound editing is provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.